Hello, my name is Natalia Popovich. I'm the chairperson of Ukraine House in Denmark, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today at Ukraine House for the, I guess, maybe second event towards and marking a third anniversary, a tragic anniversary of full-scale invasion of Russia by Russia of Ukraine. Today, we actually originally, when we were planning this event together with our partners, Charlotte Flynn Patterson and the Danish Foreign Policy Society, it was to bring together international experts, Danish, Ukrainian, and international voices to discuss the circumstances around the war at this point in time, around Ukraine, around Europe's response, and so many things have happened. Originally, we would have said we're having this discussion only after Trump's election, and then what he said about Greenland, and then what he's done about Canada or Colombia. But now I think the discussion today will be very much about what happened yesterday and the consequences or potential consequences of the United Nations and Security Council decisions as well. We are very privileged that today with us we have a great panel of speakers, and we have guests from Ukraine who we really wanted to bring to this panel discussion. So I'll start with Ukrainian guests, if I may. With us, we will have Maksym Butkevych, a human rights activist and a journalist with international track, who joined the armed forces of Ukraine when the invasion started, was captured, and for 2 years and 4 months has been in Russian captivity. And now his voice is active and back, and we're super happy to have Maksym back with us. We have Yaryna Chornohuz, with whom we actually are going to start our evening. Yaryna is the active Marine and member of Ukrainian Armed Forces, and she's a drone operator, but before she was a combat medic, and she is also a poet and a member of PEN Ukraine. We are privileged to have with us Edward Lucas, whom I don't know how to else introduce other than someone who I think was warning us all about the threat of Russia since very early. Since 1991, yes. Well, yes, I think, yeah, I've come to begin to read Edward regularly just a little bit later than maybe 1991, but yes, it was extremely, if only they listened to Edward, I would always say, and obviously extremely happy that Michael Aastrup Jensen, the Foreign Policy Committee chair, had a chance to join us as well for this important discussion, because Denmark is doing so much to help Ukraine, and I think the key question is that will that be enough, and what else can be done? So I would like to start by asking Yaryna to come up and actually maybe share a little bit of her perspective as someone who, after this trip, is also returning to the front line in Ukraine, of how the news around are making her think and feel. And I hope that Yaryna will also share a few of her poems as a start of this discussion. And then I'll turn over to Charlotte for the moderation of the meeting.
Natalia, thank you. It's an honor again to be here and speak to you. I'm a little bit nervous, as I'm used to be a soldier and I'm not a public speaker at all. So, and I'll try to share with you thoughts maybe which I have as a soldier of Ukraine Armed Forces now, and feelings what we all share there with our unit. First of all, a few words about maybe my experience, very short, because it is very up to date to this discussion. I joined the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Marine Forces in Ukraine, in 2020. I did that immediately after getting my master's degree in literature. I plan to dedicate my life to literature first. But as a lot of Ukrainians of my generation back in 2019, 2020, and all the years starting from 2013, we knew that the war is on in our country. So the politicians around all the world tried to ignore that fact. Actually, it was very, very useful for Putin. He wanted that effect during these years. We all felt that, from 2014 up to UN 2020 and up to the beginning of full-scale invasion, we had a war, a trench war on which we lost from 6 to 10 lives of our soldiers on the front line. And people like me, students, felt that Putin will use this moment. Lots of people admired why did I join to the army when all of the world thought it is already ended. But in fact, we all felt, and I read as a student the book of Edward Lucas also. It also influenced me that he will use the situation. It is important thing that all of us learned about Russia and Putin. You never can let yourself be weak. The moment you let yourself be weak, the moment you allow yourself fall into forgetfulness about what they did, this same moment they will attack you. This is very hard lesson that all of us learned from this war and from what is happening when he became a president actually of Russia. And when in 2019, 2020, I went to the front line, I saw that the guys are being killed. Ukrainian guys are being killed in total silence, in forgetfulness, with ignorance of all world. And I wanted to join the armed forces of Ukraine to first to pay my debts to my country and to sign up for 3 years in case there will be invasion or aggression. I will be ready, and I was ready. And this is now my 5th year in army. Actually, I am a mother of 10-year-old daughter, and 5 years she spent almost without me, seeing me 1 month in a year. And my husband is also Marine, so our family lives on the war totally. And lots of, soldiers maybe would find the way to quit, to stop, to think that we've already had a lot of fighting, we are still alive and we should rest. But we understand that we cannot allow that ourselves. We changed speciality. We used to be soldiers in reconnaissance unit. Me, combat medic, he is reconnaissance soldier. But we understood that we should be even stronger now. In this moment, when world, again, on this measure, before falling into forgetfulness. This is actually the thing what Russia right now wants from the world, forgetfulness. We already seen this from 2014 up to 2022, the forgetfulness, when the war is going, when in the trenches, the Ukrainian soldiers are being killed, and no one from the leaders has the courage to go on the stage and say, who will answer for this death? He wants to do that again. He wants again, after 3 years of full-scale invasion, to immerse all world into this type of forgetfulness about what is happening. And rhetoric of new politicians helps that. I'll tell you what will be if that happen. The next will happen, like our front line will be again bleeding, and the world, which is far away from Ukraine, will live in the illusion of peace, illusion. And we will feel a big loneliness, because a big loneliness is what we usually used to feel, actually, being with this task to defend our country and our existence. The another reason why I cannot just quit my service in army and be together with my daughter finally is that I understand if they occupy, if we accept bad for us terms of so-called peace, which they demand right now from us, Putin will use this peace to occupy, to attack again, to occupy more our territories. And if they occupy our territories, the family like mine, like me, my husband, my daughter, my parents, who always used to be Ukrainian speaking, patriotic Ukrainians with Ukrainian identity will be executed. I know that very clearly. I know that my apartment will belong to Russians, and all my family will be killed by them. They won't let any Ukrainian who has this position that we want to be Ukrainians to live in peace. Never. That's why I will keep fighting. And no matter how many time and how many years it will take, me and my husband, we decided that we will do that. And thanks to such nations as Danes, as Denmark, we have opportunity to fight not being alone. We have opportunity to fight with support, even more than, for me personally, even more than a military support means moral support. It means recognizing our law to fight and to defend ourselves, how long does it, no matter how long it takes. Because only when we take our territories back, I remember very well, for me, Kherson region and lots of smaller villages whose names you never heard of, like, I don't know, like Gola Pristan, like Skadovsk, like Drahizbenka or Kryakivka, like Severodonetsk, like lots of hundreds of cities, villages, which I know as a military, which I saw, beautiful places. They will never be abstraction for me. They are the places where my life was going on and where I was happy, where I was trained with guys who gave their life while I am survived. And I'll never accept the fact that this is Russian territory. Never. And never will my kids as well. So I'm telling all of this to thank you for your support. It is really very important for us, for Ukrainian soldiers. And yes, we used to do the things and not to give us to emotions, but there are emotions. And moral support is very important for us. I thought I'll take too much time. I'll read you only my poem about the dark and feeling of loneliness, which have all people on the front line, and which is our weakness and our power. A spot to red. Darkness, drunkenness, and each one of us goes alone in the dark. Even though there is no breathing room here, just shoulders, just bodies. In the dark, we each walk alone. Until it occurs to each of us, there was never any point in looking for support. All shoulders are too weak for the heart that beats in you, for the voice that speaks in you of love we've already forgotten to seek, for a love that become a sign, love for your own and love for its own sake. They don't believe in it, although in this world it's more like a sun than anything else. And the world says with its male voice, you are a spot that's too red on a canvas that's too grayish white, which makes the composition messy, so sloppily saturated in red, when everything around demands the usual black, overcoming the revolting weakness of the female body, stepping over fallen trees, your skin wrapped in several rolls of ballistic nylon, feeling the protection of the silent iron in your hands. We each feel two things, darkness, drunkenness. We each go alone in the dark. Support is unnecessary. Support beats inside you and has a voice. All shoulders are too weak to support a single heart. Strong words are always too weak. A strong body is mortal. A voice won't die out if it's no have to be. There's a soldier girl in every woman who will have to pass through the dark alone. And all help is unnecessary, and all shoulders are redundant, and all the burden is for 2 hands alone, and all love are lived and left, and all solitude is yours, and the world's whole night is like one sun for one life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you and welcome, and thank you, Yaryna. It was very moving, and I think it's important for us to understand, what's actually going on the front line in order to understand also the threat that we are actually here in. That it's not something that we can ignore. And actually, I remember, Michael, also that we had a discussion 4 or 5 years ago on, about what is the situation of Ukraine before the invasion, and we were discussing the fact that this asymmetric interest in Ukraine, that Russia didn't feel our interest sufficiently. It was asymmetric, and in that way we were also somehow guilty in the deck. So I understand the loneliness that Yaryna was talking about. There are some dates that are etched into history forever. November 11th, 1918, April 9th, 1940, November 9th, 1989, September 11th, 2001, and not at the least February 24th, 2022. These are dates that are landmark in relation to the course of history and our common future, but not in the least for the people who find themselves in this epicenter. So February 24th, 2022 also marked the return of fascism in Europe and in the form of Russian nationalism, Russism, imperialism, Putinism. Ukraine has been under attack from Russia for more than 10 years, and the full-scale illegal and unprovoked invasion has now lasted for 3 years. A full, I think, 1,097 days today. This is how long the Ukrainian defenders have been repelling the attacks of Putin's army of killers. Meanwhile, millions of civilians in Ukraine continue to fear for their families and their future. February 24th marks the importance of political leadership. Rising to the occasion and Zeitenwende became phrases characterizing the change of political direction in Europe. The dates thus reminds us of the importance of the values embedded in the European community and why we must fight for them. Russia has, throughout its history, not respected neighboring countries as sovereign states. Imperialism is part of the state's ideology. The Russian bombings show that the Ukrainians must be punished for their desire for sovereignty. The regime knows no boundaries. Now, 3 years later, it is clear that the only permanent path to peace in Europe is for Russia to be defeated in Ukraine. Therefore, the development we're seeing with negotiations between the US and Russia right now is life-threatening, not only for Ukraine, but also for the security of other European states, not least the border countries. The US seems to want to force Ukraine to accept Russian demands. It is therefore uplifting, I think, to see the European leaders gathering in Kiev on the 3rd anniversary of the invasion. So this is actually the discussion that we plan to take, me and Natalia, some months ago, that we want to discuss the role of Europe in the security and how the war in Ukraine, Russians' war in Ukraine, actually also was a war about European security. And somehow the events in the past month has preceded the discussion that we had at that time. And I just want to read to you something that happened yesterday. The United States voted with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and 14 other Moscow-friendly countries against the UN resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine and calling for the return of Ukraine territory. The resolution, sponsored by representatives from Kiev, passed luckily in the UN General Assembly, but I think it is really, astounding and shocking to all us, not only in Ukraine, but actually also in Europe, that this has happened. So I'd like for us to take here around a discussion on Ukraine and European security, and I'd like to pass the word to Edward Lucas first, a fellow at the senior fellow at the Center for European Politics, but as we heard, also a author of and a person who has warned about what happened in the role of Russia since 1991. So welcome.
Well, thanks very much indeed to Charlotte and to Natalia, the organisers, and Lena for the wonderful poems. When I look round, I see emotions swirling through this room, through Europe, through the whole transatlantic community. There's bewilderment, there's fear, there's grief, shame, and many others as well. And I want to just spend a few minutes looking at them and how we deal with this, because this is a world that I think, looking around the room, probably nobody remembers. If we have anyone here who's in their late 90s, they may remember the period in the 1930s when America was trying to sit out the rise of Nazism in Europe. But I think it's a fair bet that in all our lifetimes, we've never seen anything like that. The world that began with the American liberation of Europe from the Nazis, the Berlin airlift, the Cold War, with all the ups and downs that we had, we could never have conceived a time where we would have to count Washington and Moscow as our adversaries. And it's easy just to give way to bewilderment, just to throw our hands up and say, how can this have happened? But we won't reach safety through bewilderment. We have to focus and we have to act. And I'll talk a little bit later on some of the things that we can do. And then there's fear. This is really scary stuff. I travel all the time in the frontline states. I've just come back from Norway. I go to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia a lot. I've been in Poland very recently. And I've also just come back from Helsinki. And you really feel it there. People think, who's going to protect us now? Will our American weapons work? We've spent all this money on F-35 fighters and JASSM missiles and all these other things. If we need to use them, what happens if Trump says, I'm not having American weapons used in a war against Russia? And I know warplanes don't have an ignition, but I imagine you press some sort of button to get it going and something comes up on the screen saying software update needed. And or the phone goes. And it's Trump on the phone saying, don't use that weapon. So we feel really scared. And we also feel scared on an individual basis because we have all these attacks going on. You have not just the subsea infrastructure being attacked, but we have people being beaten up and kidnapped, poisoned. We have extraordinary, we saw Russian spies in Britain who were on trial, just been on trial. They were actually Bulgarians, but working for the GRU. And they were planning to kidnap a journalist and take him off to Syria to be dealt with. That was their instruction from Moscow. It was Christo Grozev, the senior investigator at Bellingcat. And I regularly talk to people now who have bodyguards, they have panic buttons, they have special numbers to phone if they see someone outside their house. And so that's very demoralizing, the fear. And then there's the grief, and there's no getting away from it. We have had a catastrophic failure of defense and deterrence in Europe, and hundreds of thousands of people are either dead or physically maimed or mentally traumatized or driven from their home. Just go upstairs after this event and look at the wonderful exhibition of a house that's been erased from our cultural landscape by the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. So we could spend all day just mourning our human and physical and economic losses. And then the shame, and that actually is a more productive emotion because we should feel really ashamed about this. We were warned back in the 1990s, just down the road from here in Hamburg in December 1994, the Estonian President Lennart Meri gave a speech to a Baltic Sea dinner, warning with crystalline prescience about this toxic combination of Soviet nostalgia and Russian ethno-nationalism. And he told the audience in very unvarnished terms of the danger they were facing. And what's so interesting about that dinner is the Russian delegation were led out of the room in protest by the leader of that delegation, who'd never heard Russia criticized in such terms before. The delegation was rather sad because the speech was before the starter. They were looking forward to a nice meal. And he slammed the door behind him. I wonder if anyone in this room knows who the leader of that Russian delegation was. Yes, the head of the Foreign Economic Relations Department of the city of St. Petersburg, a humble, corrupt, obscure bureaucrat called Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So this goes back a long way. We ignored it because we were greedy and complacent and a bit arrogant. And we said to the Baltic states and the Ukrainians and others, you've got post-traumatic stress disorder, you've got these prejudices against Russians, you don't understand. And anyway, we want to get on and make money. And we certainly don't want to spend money on defense. So I think everyone can look back and ask, what did I know? When did I know it? What could I have done differently? And so a bit of shame on the Western side is really important. But most of all, we've got to act. Our main emotion should be courage, should be determination, should be the desire to make good what's gone wrong. And there's an awful lot we can do. We're not going to complain our way to victory. We're not going to worry our way to safety. We have to act. And we can do this. The Nordic Baltic countries, those Nordic Baltic 8, is what, the 12th richest country in the world, if it was one country. Add in Poland, I think it's the 8th biggest. Just those 9 countries have a bigger GDP than Russia. Now, their defense spending is less, but right here, you only have one job: defend yourself and help Ukraine. Russia has to do everything: satellites, blue water navy, worry about China, all these things. So we can do this. The Americans have a great phrase: you can cook plenty with what you've got in the kitchen. And we've got a lot in the kitchen. Our problem, it's not like standing up to China, which is genuinely difficult. This is an economy the size of Italy. So we can do this. We just have to want to do it. I'm working on 2 projects at the moment. One is a defense bank, like the EBRD, which raised money for the reconstruction of Eastern Europe, taking a small amount of public money, borrowing a lot of private money, then developing expertise, making loans, and wasn't a profit maximizing bank, but it was a profit making bank. And it's got, I think, 180 billion euros lent out over the last 30 years. So I want to do that for defense. And we can do that. We have got the Poles on board, they're leading. We've got the Brits, I think. The Germans are positive. The French are interested. So we can do that. That could get us 250 billion by the end of the year. And we can use that either for defending ourselves or buying stuff from Ukraine or donating stuff to Ukraine. So we can do that. And then we've also got to think about military involvement in Ukraine. The other thing I'm working on is not published yet, but I can tell you it's called Sky Shield. And that's the idea for a Western-led air and missile defense shield over Western Ukraine. Now, we can't cover the whole of Ukraine. We don't have enough stuff, but we can shield Western Ukraine, and that frees up Ukrainian assets to defend other areas. Again, we can do this. We've got the stuff. We just need the political determination, the willingness of our political decision makers to say, yes, if they try and shoot down one of our planes, we will shoot back. So that's what we have to do. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much indeed for inviting me.
And to Maksym Butkevych, and maybe you could provide a perspective from Ukraine and also from your experience on what should we be, how do you see the perspective of European security, and how can we mobilize, the courage and the decisiveness on this?
Thank you very much. Well,
To comment on other things, yeah.
yeah, thank you. I will probably see some things from a different perspective, slightly, not only geographically, but, it's an honor to be on this panel together with you, all of you, and after such important things just voiced by Mr. Lucas, who really was one of those who warned the whole world who wanted to listen a long time ago about what's about to come. To be honest, there was a point in time when I thought that, Mr. Lucas, it's not that you sounded like a doomsday prophet, no. But there was a short period in time when I was a little bit more optimistic about this scenario. It was long, long time ago. It was in previous life. And just very recently, there was another upsurge on Ukrainian social media of a remembrance of the beginning of 90s in Ukraine, not only about economic hardships or newly gained independence, but specifically about that time vision, and it was widespread, I remember it, that Ukraine should become sort of a model country of Europe when it comes to peacefulness and political neutrality. And the culmination of all that was, of course, the astonishing fact that Ukraine, being at the time, as far as I remember, the third country in the world when it comes to nuclear weapons capacity, just decided to give them up, to give up nuclear weapons, trying to be, the nicest one, trying to be some sort of a country of the future, which really looks into the future where there will be no nuclear, not only nuclear proliferation, but nuclear weapons as such. So Ukrainians want to be one step ahead in the future. And there was Budapest Memorandum, which accompanied it, one of the most shameful pieces of paper signed internationally, where four big powers guaranteed Ukraine, almost guaranteed Ukraine security in exchange for nuclear weapons elimination. And nowadays, the vast majority of Ukrainians regret that decision and take it with remorse. Even if I remember that I was happy at the time, I was really happy. I wanted to look into the future at the world which will be, maybe not living in eternal peace, but leading towards that, going towards that end. The best teacher of effect that the only security guarantee any country or any state tries to get is the bomb, and that nuclear non-proliferation is as good as dead, turned out to be, on one hand, Russian imperialism, which has shown that no agreement, no international convention or anything worth more than a piece of paper they're signed upon, if one of the sides does not follow ancient pacta sunt servanda principle, that agreements should be honored and observed. And at the same time, of course, other parties which sort of guaranteed security to Ukraine, at the end of the day, haven't done what was needed. And one of them is now sidelining together with the aggressor state. And I mean, of course, Mr. Trump being on the same side, literally, as in the UN resolution vote with the war criminal, Mr. Putin, again shows that if there are any security guarantees, they should be technical, practical, and enforceable. So Ukrainians are not interested in memorandums, declarations, even agreements which are not followed up by technical implementation plans, and preferably physical presence of those who guarantee security on the ground, meaning, yes, international troops in Ukraine. At the beginning of the 90s, Ukraine was very little known to the vast majority of even Europeans. I remember myself in 1997 when it was my first foreign trip outside of former USSR, and I arrived to Paris. I've met probably just 2 or 3 people who knew what Ukraine is. Most they either associated it with Russia or just said ce nouveau pays de l'Est il n'a pas existé quand nous avons été à l'école. All these new countries of Europe, they haven't existed when we studied at school. Then things started to change. First, it was sports. And of course, for some people, they remember Chernobyl. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster was in Ukraine. Then there was Orange Revolution. And as one of the books titles about Ukraine, I think it was very characteristic. Ukrainians, unexpected nation. Suddenly, Ukraine came up on the mental map of Europe. And of course, later on, there were other developments in Maidan Revolution of Dignity. And then Ukraine actually appeared in the eye of the storm. So Ukraine has been the center of the first proxy war in Europe of that scale since 2014. And another question, of course, a lot of Ukrainians ask themselves why, when one part of the country, European country, has been taken over by force by another neighboring state, other states did not interfere or did not react properly. Then, in very different areas of life, Ukraine became the most important factor. Like for those who are interested in religious matters, the biggest split in Eastern Orthodox Christianity came about due to Ukraine and Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And this involves so many countries and so many dozens of millions of people. And now we see what we see, actually. Yes, the biggest war in Europe since the World War II and destruction of what remained of security system in Europe, undermining consistent and on purpose of what remained of international humanitarian law being destroyed by Russian Federation, ignored, but not only ignored, being ridiculed, being basically used as a tool for manipulation. This now already very familiar wording, hybrid war, which is waged by Russia against freer European nations, not only European ones, but European in the first place. What really surprises many in Ukraine, including myself, against the background of all of it, how comes vast sections of many European nations still perceive what is going on as purely Russian-Ukrainian story, a certain distant conflict on the outskirts of Europe, which can be, interesting, important. Of course, sympathies can be with Ukraine, but when one gets tired of it, he or she thinks, well, probably it will not affect me anyway. Well, it already does affect, because it is obvious that Ukraine does not fight for itself only. Of course, Ukraine does not fight for territories. Ukraine fights for its people, its identity, and its ability to choose its own future, its own destiny. But also it fights for rights, human rights, and for civil liberties, for the values which are common to all of us, those who want to build more free societies, streaming toward ideal where people can live in justice, peace, and without fear, and where human being is respected. This is something which goes totally against the main narratives of the Russian world, of Pax Russica, of ideology of Putinism. And for some reason, I still meet, while traveling around European countries, quite a lot of people who seem not to understand it. Another thing is, it is said in Ukraine sometimes, I don't know to what extent it's correct actually, but Ukrainians think so, a lot of them. No country, no community paid such a huge price for just desire to be part of Europe. Europe as a system of values, Europe as community of free nations, Europe as an ideal, not as a territory even. And for some reason, this fact does not seem to be recognized by many parts of Europe itself. So this dialogue, and fortunately there is a dialogue, this dialogue sometimes look peculiar, to put it mildly, like kind of weird. Of course, things change, and they change for better when it comes to European subjectivity, European ability to act independently, especially when it comes to recent developments in transatlantic relationships. But will European nations and European structures be decisive enough, fast enough, organized enough to finally mobilize itself, take back subjectivity in order to help Ukraine and help themselves to be prepared, I'm afraid, to the worst case scenario? Because we Ukrainians now know that one should hope for better and strive for it and fight for it, but also at the same time be prepared to worst. And thus you won't be disappointed. So this is what we do. But I'm afraid this is almost a universal principle now. Will other parts of Europe outside of Ukraine be prepared to do the same? This is a huge, huge question for us. And last but not least, of course, Ukraine not only fights for 3 years of full-scale invasion and 11 years of war, aggression from Russian Federation. You know, when full-scale invasion started and I joined Ukrainian armed forces, not being a military person by my design, not being a military by my worldview, I never thought actually I will be military, but now being a military is part of my identity. I remember when the European Union, I just told several people that already decided to grant temporary protection to Ukrainian nationals for 1 year, with the possibility of extension of it for another year. A lot of people in Ukraine thought, no, it can't be possible that this war will last for 2 years. It's too long. But we are still there 3 years afterwards, and Russian Federation, which intended to erase us from the map, both physically and mentally in few weeks' time, still fights on the eastern front lines of Ukraine, which means that part of victory is already here. Russia did not achieve its goals, it's for sure, and its original goals will never be achieved. It is also very clear. So Ukrainians are determined to fight tooth and nail, because as I said, they defend much more important things. But, of course, as this is the war of attrition, and our resources are incomparable with those of the aggressor state, which prepared itself for this war during long, long years of military build-up and intervention in other local armed conflicts and building up its huge, marvelous propaganda machine, which made this war possible. So without external support, of course, it will be, let's put it this way, utmost difficult for Ukraine to achieve at least to an extent just peace. And of course, what is important there, that this peace is accompanied by security guarantees, not of the kind of Budapest Memorandum, but something much more real. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think this is actually a perfect transition to Michael Aastrup. I also have to say that being chair of the Foreign Policy Committee, he's also a member of the European, not the European Parliament, but the Council of Europe and the Monitoring Commission of the parliamentary. Monitoring Commission of the. So you know a lot about what's going on in Russia and this. So, but over to you. So, what is actually, how can we in Europe? Are we ready? Are we mobilized? How do you see the urgency spell out when you talk to your colleagues out there and in Denmark as such?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the welcome and also the possibility to discuss something that is very, very close to my heart. I've been in the Danish Parliament for 20 years, and in 17 of those 20 years, I worked with international politics. And right now, I'm, as Charlotte said, I'm chairman of the Foreign Policy Committee, which actually have a very strong mandate compared to our European counterparts, because our mandate is actually stipulated in the Danish constitution, where it says quite clearly that the Danish government has to seek advice and consent from my committee before they take any greater decisions on foreign policy and security. So that means every donations we given to Ukraine has to go through my committee. And I'm so happy, actually, as chairman, that even though we have committee members from left to right, we have 12 parties in the Danish Parliament. We are fairly, not balanced, but fairly unique in that sense. It has been a completely unanimous committee. Every time we voted, should we send donations to Ukraine or shouldn't we send donations to Ukraine? And actually just yesterday, we actually just made it official that we sent out a new donation, 3 billion Danish kroners worth, and we are continuing that approach. So even though we all saw Vice President J.D. Vance, and I actually had the opportunity to be in Munich and in the room when he said so, and I was fairly surprised and thought I was dreaming. But we all saw his speech. But it has not discouraged us in any ways of still continuing on from the Danish perspective. And just for saying something proud before I touch down in all the politics, I don't know how many Danes actually know this, but we're number 4 in general numbers of military equipment donations to Ukraine. Number 4. We're 6 million people, but we're number 4. US ahead. So US ahead, and we also see Germany, and we also see the UK ahead of us. But then we're number 4 in military equipment donations too. And if you look by GDP, we're number 1. So I'm just saying this to say quite clearly there are a difference in Europe, because unfortunately, if you look on big countries like, for example, France, you have to look way down on the list. So we see a president who talks a lot, he says the right things, but if you come to donations, there perhaps should be some bit of more action. And a lot of European countries are doing the same. So we really need to stress that we are going to continue on, but we need help from Europe. And we need help because right now it's crunch time. Because I actually believe the Trump administration will pull out its donations to Ukraine. We do not know what's going to happen in these talks that apparently are going on, but the war will continue on for the moment. And right now, Ukraine still need our full support. They need our full support on the battlefield. They need our full support regarding the rebuilding of liberated territories, like, for example, what Denmark is doing in Mykolaiv region. They need our full support. And therefore, let's also be quite frank in this room. We see a wariness spreading around. We're actually even seeing it in Danish Parliament as well. You know, I'm not a diplomat, so I can be frank. People say I'm too frank, but we actually have, as I mentioned, 12 parties in Danish Parliament. But we actually see two, thankfully the smallest parties in the Danish Parliament, but we see two parties actually right now voicing their, let's say, discussion regarding if we should still support Ukraine or not. The brand new party, which I don't even think have an official European name, but the Party of Citizens in Denmark, in Danish, Borgernes Parti, which are quite, outspoken that they want to end the donations to Ukraine, and then the Danish People's Party as well. Thankfully, they're not part of my committee. So we still have complete unanimous support every time we send out donations. Why does it raise it? Because if we do not even at this crunch time can join forces and say, this is not only for Ukraine's fault, which should be enough in its own sense, but this is actually for our own security as well. Please bear in mind, 1.5 weeks ago, the Danish intelligence agencies put forward completely open and stated that the buildup of Russian military forces capacity, where about 20 to 30% of their overall economy is being brought forward to military buildup, and their mobilization, which is just continuing on and on and on, they will have a bigger and bigger army that if the war in Ukraine ends in a way that benefits Russia, perhaps with a ceasefire that benefits Russia, then Russia will be in a capacity for a regional war, not only against its weaker states like Moldova and Georgia, but also in a regional conflict against a NATO member. For example, the Baltic states, Finland, or other ones. I think that's why we see our Baltic friends are right now militarizing the border. They have troops at the border stationed 24/7. And every time I meet the Finnish ambassador, he tells me how many new bunkers they've built up at the border. They're gearing up for what they hope never happens, but they're gearing up for it. Because let's put it like it is. What is Russia building up for? If they have 20 to 30% of their overall economy being spent on military, it's probably not for 1st of May grand military, demonstration on the Red Square. It's probably because they want to use it. Because otherwise, it's hurting their general economy if they just keep spending on a military they're not going to use. And therefore, I have to be frank with you. I'm very, very worried about the future. Extremely worried about the future. I'm worried that Russia will continue on this aggressive. And other of our friends are worried as well. When I was in Ukraine the last time, I visited Mykolaiv, and therefore I drove through Moldova. I had an opportunity to had a meeting with the president of Moldova, extremely courageous woman, who stated quite clearly, it is her understanding that if Russia is not stopped by the fearless Ukrainian soldiers, they will continue on and occupy all of Moldova. Bear in mind that Russia already occupied some part of Moldova, but they will occupy the complete part of it. Whole of it. And this is what we're up against. We're up against a country that through decades have shown their willingness to start wars. Let's remember the war in Georgia in 2008. They still occupied parts of Georgia. So to conclude, I'm stating we need to gear up. We need to be ready to isolate, to punish Russia as much as possible through direct sanctions, even more, to freeze up the Russian money that Europe has frozen and spend it on Ukrainian defense. We need to do stuff like this today so that we can be ready for whatever comes tomorrow. And we have to do it ourselves in Europe, because no matter what, apparently we cannot trust how it was, but now we have to see how it is. And right now it's only Europe, and therefore we have to do this today in the European Union and with our countries that are not part of the European Union anymore, but we perhaps can gear up for even more closer cooperation, for example, with the UK, Norway, and others. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we are able to do it if we really are trying. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I think I'd like to provide a possibility of commentary to what has been said, Edward. So if you would just reflect on what Maksym and what Michael said in terms of reflection, and it's really sort of it's not optimistic, really, is it, at the moment?
Well, no, it's not great, but we still, as I said, have agency. I think actually the most dangerous thing of all, which is not Trump's fault, it's Biden's, is that Putin has shown that nuclear blackmail worked. You touched on this with the Budapest Memorandum, but knowing what we know now, it was nuts to give up those nuclear weapons, even though it was just a stockpile. You had no way of delivering them. But the message that's gone out loud and clear all over the world is, if you have nuclear weapons, hang on to them. If you haven't got nuclear weapons, think about getting them. And so this has just driven a hole the size of the Dnieper River through the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I hear all over the place people talking about how long would it take us to get nukes, because we don't trust the Americans anymore. It's not just that the intimidation, Putin's nuclear intimidation, succeeded because Ukraine didn't have nuclear weapons. The American nuclear guarantee is shredded. I don't think anyone really believes that Trump would risk nuclear war to defend Europe in a crisis. And people don't believe the American nuclear guarantee in East Asia anymore. So whether it's Japanese, Taiwanese, South Koreans, or Ukrainians talk about it, I hear Poles talking about it privately. So that is a terrifying new departure which takes us in a direction that would have seemed unimaginable only 10 or 15 years ago. As I say, Trump has accelerated this, but actually this started under Biden. It was a huge failure of Western deterrence that Putin thought he could get away with 2014, let alone with the full-scale invasion. We've shredded our deterrence under Democratic and Republican presidents. And it was also a huge failure of defense. We didn't give Ukraine the weapons they needed to defend themselves. If we'd given Ukraine at the beginning of the war what we've given them now, the war would already be over and Russia would have lost. But it's always been too little and too late, even with all hats off to the amazing efforts that Denmark has done. But we've always worried, sucking our thumbs, scratching our heads, what happens if we give them these weapons? Will it be provocative? And then we give them and it's too late. We could have started training Ukrainian F-16 pilots after 2014. We could have donated dozens, scores, hundreds of slightly obsolete Western fighter aircraft to Ukraine in those years. And then Ukraine would have had a fantastic air force and everything would be looking different. The other thing I just want to say very briefly is Ukraine has also taught us a huge amount, not just about physical resilience and courage, but also about innovation. You've changed the face of warfare, you and your drone people. You develop things in months that Western militaries take years to do. You do it at 1/10, 1/20, 1/100th of the cost. You train people in a fraction of the time, and they're far more effective. So this has changed the face of warfare, and I really hope that Western militaries and Western defense industries are learning the lessons that you have brought with your blood and tears and sacrifice.
Thank you. And Michael, I'd just like to ask you, do you see a transformation of Europe taking place? Do you see that we we in Denmark actually can mobilize the Nordic countries more. Like Norway needs to get into the game, I guess, a lot, but also mobilizing and using the strength of the Nordic countries that we actually have together in mobilizing weapons production, security concerns. Do you see a transformation actually of Europe taking place? So that Europe becomes a new concept. It's not just the EU, but it's Britain, it's Norway, it's Ukraine, which actually is a sort of, so that there's also a potential hope if we actually manage to do what we do, that we should do.
Well, absolutely. First of all, I will be the first one to actually say there's a lot of things that European Union should have been doing better, and it's shameful that Hungary can still drag their feet regarding the huge economic donations to Ukraine, so we cannot give it to Ukraine. It's shameful. But let's compare to 10 years ago or just 5 years ago and see what European Union can actually do today regarding sanctions against Russia and so on, so on. They can actually do something, and it's our best opportunity right now. But it should not stand on its own. I see absolutely that the Nordics, perhaps NB8 as we call it, the Nordic Baltic states, we see closer and closer cooperation. Just yesterday, our Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister was actually in Kiev, and they stated on behalf of the Nordic states that we have joined forces now in educating and building up a brigade in Ukraine. So we are going to join forces regarding that, regarding training and so on. As you probably know, we with the British were in charge of training the F-16 pilots. When we gave them all our artillery pieces, we were training them in artillery. So we have actually quite great knowledge and experience regarding educating the Ukrainian soldiers. And we will continue on with that with our Nordic friends. So yes, both regarding Ukraine, we will absolutely cooperate more. And regarding our own defense, absolutely. There are discussions regarding should we try to integrate even more. There are, of course, going to be a NATO summit in June. We will see what happens, aka what the Trump administration will put forward. But whatever happens at the summit, we will absolutely integrate even more. And it's the biggest benefit for Danish defense is, of course, that Sweden and Finland join NATO. It helps our defense enormous. And therefore, we will absolutely have even greater cooperation, perhaps even on buying the same military equipment. It's something we are discussing, and we're looking into it. But we have not finalized anything yet, but we are absolutely discussing it.
And Maksym, what would you like from us, things that we're not doing at the moment? What would you like for the Danes to do? What do you see? What kind of potential do you see that we could do if we were to do even more?
Wow, that's a question. Well, in the first place, I'm happy to say once again that the assistance, the participation and sympathy in very practical terms, which is felt and experienced by Ukraine from Denmark, is perceived and received with lots of gratitude and admiration. Thank you very much for that, really. And when it comes to, probably it's easier to talk not about Denmark, because it's done so much by Denmark, but in wider European context. Well, one thing I've already talked about, which is understanding a different take on what is going on in Ukraine, not treating it as some distant story. I just some time ago, I think actually it was still when I was in captivity and experienced what Russian world brings to newly occupied territories, which is a pretty much Soviet system or Soviet-like system of humiliation and repressions, which hasn't changed much. It is interesting because basically Russia wages quite a classical imperialist war of 19th century, imposing on occupied territories a regime of terror of kind of Stalinist regime, but does it all with the weapons of 21st century, which makes it really, really dangerous. What also I see that Ukraine now accumulated already and continues to accumulate vast knowledge, not being possessed by any other country, not only in Europe, but probably worldwide. When it comes to modern warfare, something you've just mentioned, really, we've done things which have never been done by any other country on the battlefield. Also, when it comes to medical treatment of soldiers, of military injured in combat operations, when I was treated in a medical military center, I had the chance to talk to the military doctors who said that their work is a subject of interest from specialists from all over the world, basically. And there are a lot of other things which we are trying to do which have not been done by anyone before. Currently, we also face, among other challenges, a challenge of setting up a system of rehabilitation and reintegration of former prisoners of war, but also former combat veterans who suffered psychological or physical trauma. These systems are in place in many countries, but they never face challenges of treating or caring about at least dozens of thousands of people, or maybe even more. And we should do that, because if not that, if we won't be able to do this, we face a risk to be torn apart as a community by people who suffer from trauma. And it is a mission impossible, but we will do that. And I hope it will be done also with support from our partners, not only when it comes to military tasks or humanitarian tasks, but also setting up things like this system. It is important. And when I was in captivity, I just thought that, it's an old, very probably too well-known example about the Second World War, that when it started, quite a lot of politicians stated that they were taken by surprise by Hitler's Germany actions, while, as a matter of fact, he explained his vision and his program in Mein Kampf many, many years before, very clearly stating what he intends to do. And it was just ignored because maybe it was too uncomfortable. Same here, every day while watching Russian propaganda TV, I've heard that they explained day after day, week after week to their own population that they are at war with the West, with Western nations, Western countries, not only Ukraine, with the West, and that West should be subjugated and destroyed in very plain language. Well, actually, I also mentioned it a couple of times that on the very second day of my captivity, Russian military officers told me that despite the special military operation, as they call it, didn't go as planned, it will be over very soon with Ukraine being destroyed. And then they said we'll have the most battle-hardened army in Europe and we'll be so ready to move forward. And I asked them to Poland or to Baltic states, and they said, why limit ourselves with Poland? And it's not that they take decisions, of course not. Only the national leader and his accomplices do. But it is about prevailing mood among Russian military, at least in 2022. So I think it should be understood. And last but not least, or maybe two things. What, of course, worries me is the system of terror which is installed by Russia on occupied territories, total absence of international monitoring of what goes on in places of detention. As we as POWs were never visited by ICRC, the International Committee of Red Cross, or any other international organization. We were told when we were subjected to violence, but by our guards, or tortures and mistreatment, we were told that they can do whatever they like with us, specifically because no one has access to us. No one knows what conditions we are held in. And currently there are thousands of Ukrainian POWs being held in those conditions, and many more civilians who are captured and are behind Russian bars. So to do whatever possible to get them released is really important. This is why there was still there is this initiative of human rights organizations, not only Ukrainian ones, that release of at least big number of people should be a precondition to any peace talks, not the consequence or outcome, but the precondition. And second, very technical thing, which sounds really worrisome, and it is discussed a lot. It was discussed on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference as well. The speed and scale of weapons production in Russia is incomparable with same in Europe. It is incomparable, despite sanctions, despite all the efforts Russia puts into it. I don't know, I'm not an economist, especially not in this area, but I don't know if there are any incentives to be used to do whatever possible, basically, to have tools at disposal, practical things to defend European nations from the possible aggression. Because if it's not done, the weapons arsenal at the moment and the production means are incomparable. There is, even if there is a decisiveness and desire to defend ourselves, we should have weapons at hand to defend us with something. So I think this is a very crucial issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question regarding, because one of the things that we're saying that a victory, a Ukrainian victory, might be able to, you could say, push the Russian regime to its end. Do you think that, can we actually have, will a Russian victory, as you have, maybe have a sort of an understanding of what goes on in that, is that all, or do we just have an encapsulation of Russia? If you, if you can actually push them out of Ukraine, will that topple the regime, or will we still have to live with it in many years to come?
Well, on one hand, current Russian regime, they actually cornered themselves from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion when they've set the goals which they cannot achieve. So now it's not, they've burned the bridges basically, so now it's very difficult for them just to say, okay, we liberated Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and that means we won. No, because they from the very beginning stated something very different. On the other hand, having such a huge and marvelous propaganda machine, they can easily call black-white and vice versa. There was old Soviet joke when different leaders compared their weapons historically. And at the end of it, the most powerful turned out to be Soviet Pravda newspaper, because it's not about victory on the battlefield, but that no one will know that there was no victory. And the same here, basically, they can call whatever, and Russian population will happily believe it, forgetting what was told, what they were fed with day before yesterday. And still, the defeat of Russia in Ukraine changes the perspective. When I was still in the military, but before capture, there was a piece in, I think it was op-ed in the New York Times by Timothy Snyder, which was called, "Let's Face It, Russia is a Fascist State." It was the springtime of 2022. It was criticized by my colleagues and friends of mine who are involved in studies of fascism professionally. because they thought it lacks methodological clarity or precisiveness or something. But I found points Timothy Snyder made very essential, especially when he stated that regimes like contemporary Russian one cannot be defeated ideologically because they do not involve themselves in disputes. They should be defeated on the battlefield because it shows the subjugated population that their leader, who is above everything and is, cannot make any mistakes, cannot be criticized, actually led the nation and the country to the doom. So it should be done. On the other hand, as much as I would like to see Russian Federation, I am very honest here. I did not think so a few years ago, now I do. I want to see Russian Federation ceasing to exist in its current form. For one simple reason, there was never Russian Federation not being an empire. Russian Empire never existed without having Ukraine as a part of it. They want to be an empire again, and they cannot be an empire without Ukraine. Without Ukraine, they're just Moscow Tsardom. And as long as Russian Federation in its current form neighbors Ukraine, we will have another mission impossible: to be a democracy, to safeguard human rights, civil liberties, but at the same time to be every minute prepared for war, for invasion from our neighbor. We are not blessed by having these neighbors. We are blessed by having some friends, and we are not blessed by having some other friends, as it turned out. But someone's got to be there. Well, it turned out to be Ukraine. Well, we will try to do what we can, but it is a very difficult task ahead.
Before I hand over the mic or the questions to the floor, I just want to ask Edward, how do you see, you could say, the trajectory, if it was a positive one, if we actually, what would happen? How would we deal with Russia in the end? As you know Russia very well and the Soviet Union very well, the whole thinking at that time. So how should it end?
Well, I think the only stable state is when Russia or some country or countries on the territory of what's now the Russian Federation stop being an empire. Because empires have two problems. They treat their own people quite badly, and they treat their neighbors worse. And this imperial mentality is very deeply ingrained in Russia. It's very odd because even Russian liberals don't understand it. I was at a conference in Tallinn with a very famous Russian dissident now living in Estonia, and he talked about Putinism and this and that. And I said, look, you've left out a very big thing, which is imperialism. And to me, Russian imperialism, it was there in the Soviet era and it was there after 91. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I lived in Moscow all my life. I never saw imperialism. And I said, well, I think perhaps the Estonians saw it here. And all my Estonian friends came up afterwards and said, thank you for saying that. And all the Russians came up afterwards and said, why are you being so nasty? And so there's this saying that Russian liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. And I'm afraid there's a long way to go on this. I don't see how Russia kind of, to use the phrase we sometimes use in Western academia, it needs to decolonize itself. It needs to decolonize its understanding of what it means to be Russian, of its understanding of what it means not to be Russian on the territory of Russia, whether you're a Tatar or Bashkir or Ingrian or whatever. It needs to decolonize its attitudes to its history. It needs to decolonize its attitude to its neighbors. I think that's a generational task. Now, we gave Germany a pretty good, sort of a pretty bracing experience in 1945, to put it mildly. And we sort of herded Germans into cinemas at gunpoint to watch films about concentration camps to try and make them understand what they'd done. And looking at Sunday's election result, I'm not sure we perhaps did it thoroughly enough. So that's pretty worrying. But I mean, even with Germany, it was difficult, and they'd actually lost a war. So how do you expect Russia to drop this ethno-nationalism and imperialism without losing a war? I don't know. And it's very interesting, if they did lose a war, and there was a time when it looked that Ukraine was going to win quite dramatically, the big worry in Western countries was about disintegration. There's a great Russian word, smuta, which means literally time of troubles or trouble. And I remember talking to the Germans about this, and they said our number one priority is that whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia shouldn't break up. And I said, well, A, it's not really up to you. And B, don't you think you should listen to the countries next to Russia who go, smuta, shmuta, we've had this before. The main thing we don't want is Russian victorious. We'll cope with chaos. It'll be horrible. Then we may have all sorts of disruption, refugees and other bad things happening. But a successful, victorious fascist Russia, imperialism on steroids, that'll be even worse. And that divide is still there in Europe. So I have no easy or optimistic answer to your question, except be prepared.
And Michael, in the Foreign Policy Committee, have you discussed what does our victory look like? What is the ideal situation? Because you can't have a sort of a Hitler situation, because we'll never get to the boundaries of the Kremlin and stand there outside the gates. So what is what's the end game here?
That's a very, very good question, because the end game is somehow shifting. Many, many years ago, I was actually fairly optimistic regarding the very, very small minority of liberals that there are in Russia. But then my very close friend, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down just outside of Kremlin. I spoke to his funeral in Moscow. That's the last time I was allowed into Moscow. Vladimir Kurza, who is also a very, very close friend of mine, who was tried to be killed twice by the Russian intelligence, and then were put into jail on a bogus charge, and thankfully were released in a prison exchange with the Americans a couple of months ago, or 4 months ago, or something like that. So what I mean by that is, I fully agree that there are no opposition in Russia. Let's be frank. So people who are saying that if Vladimir Putin, who is a fairly old guy, got a heart attack tomorrow, then perhaps it will look a bit brighter. I'm not that optimistic, not in any way. And therefore, we have to look at the end game and saying, what should we do? And stabilization is actually the best end game. Because if we also have to be frank, what is happening right now is a geopolitical battle, some would say on a scale of a world war. We have the big players, China, Russia, in some sense, Iran, North Korea, and perhaps even BRICS Plus somehow playing a role. And they have a common enemy. They don't agree on much, but they have a common enemy, and that is us. They want to destabilize the West as much as possible. They want to destabilize our position as much as possible, both on economic terms, on military terms, on almost every term. So what I mean by your very excellent question is, there are no clear end game, other than we have to gear up, be ready for whatever happens. Sorry for being so pessimistic.
Yeah.
One is that we have a Russia problem, not a Putin problem. They personalize this. Our problem is that Russia predate Putin and will outlast him. The second is there is only one Russian opposition, and it's called the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have some time for questions. Do we have time? Yeah. Okay, time for questions. So we'll open up the floor, and I can see Charlotte Slender. If you introduce, maybe, yeah.
I'm representing the Danish Refugee Council that's who supports Ukraine on the front line with a lot of humanitarian assistance for people in need for life-saving support. We also, let me see if this works. It does, maybe it does. Yes, it does. And we support with mine clearance and clearance of unexploded ordnance. We support early recovery, rebuilding of infrastructure for civilians, and have been doing so for, throughout the full-scale invasion, but also before, and very large contributions both from the Danish government, but also from other governments. Thanks for wonderful, interesting presentations, but not very optimistic ones from the panel here. My question is related to what other instruments do we have in our toolbox? You have talked about the military instruments, you've talked about the economic instruments, you've talked about the sanctions instruments, but do you see any diplomatic political tools that are not fully utilized at this moment? Any opportunities in that toolbox that should be undocked and used in this present extremely complicated geopolitical scenario where the U.S. seems to be shifting its supports away from the Western way of engaging? Is there anything we haven't done? Any actors that are not mobilized at this moment that could be positively mobilized for this cause? Thanks.
There's 300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets. We should pass a law and seize them. They're mostly held in the Eurozone, some of them mostly in Belgium, some in Britain. I actually have tried with Ukrainian activists in London to write legislation which would allow the British government to seize the 27 billion that's held in sterling. I would love to spend that money on the reconstruction of Ukraine. I think I'd actually spend it on bribing President Trump. Perhaps not direct bribe, but say, this is Russian money, we just took it and we're going to spend it on American weapons. I think that would get his attention. So that's one thing. Another thing we could do is we could be a lot more imaginative with sanctions, with visa sanctions. We are the European Union Schengen zone plus Britain is one of the most attractive places in the world for people to come and visit. So I would say to the people who trade Russian oil in Dubai, the people who sell Russia the chips for the drones, all these people, and their bankers and their lawyers and their accountants and their spouses and parents and offspring, sorry guys, you can't come to Europe anymore. Pyongyang's very nice at this time of year. Try going there. So we can do that. We did this with Nashi, the Hitler Jugend, during the Bronze Soldier. The Estonians put them all on the Schengen blacklist. And these golden youth, the Zolotoy Молодежь of the Doré Jeunesse of Russia, were horrified because there was this little country they didn't take seriously, and suddenly they couldn't go skiing in France anymore. Quelle horreur. And so we can do this. These are all questions of political will. We just need to think outside the box. And it may hurt us. It may be stuff that's bad for business, bad for our reputation, our tourism industries or whatever. But if we really care about our own freedom and safety, let alone the Ukrainians' freedom and safety, then we're going to have to do stuff. And it's really going to hurt, but it'll hurt the Russians even more.
Yes, I completely agree on that. Thank you very much. In the first place, I want to say that I was honored to work with people from Danish Refugee Council before the beginning of the proxy war in 2014, because as a human rights defender, I was preoccupied mainly with the assistance to refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine. It was one of my two priorities. The second one was counteracting or acting against discrimination, racism, and the other forms of xenophobia. So when I was taken captive and was accused of being a Nazi, I thought that Ukrainian far-right groups who threatened me would be really surprised, But I was honored to cooperate with DRC in Ukraine. There was a very good project on children, refugees, and some other efforts were made as well. Thank you. And to add to what Mr. Lucas just said, which is utmost important, I would say that there is a huge demand for justice to be done, or probably at least attempts to get justice done. And with the constant undermining, a recent one, but constant undermining of International Criminal Court by the United States with the sanctions, and basically turning the UN institutions into a joke, unfortunately. There are other mechanisms and tools to be used. Fortunately, there is a Council of Europe and Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which actually, as far as I understand, reached the decision already to set up a special tribunal on the crime of aggression against the Russian Federation, which is very important. And in the absence of other international institutions of this sort, suddenly, maybe for some, the countries which practice to a different extent universal jurisdiction are also very important, so that those who committed war crimes and continue to do so could be investigated and tried abroad, or at least put on the wanted list of Interpol or other agencies by countries with universal jurisdiction. So, of course, it will not do justice 100%. It is never done 100%. But at least it will show that Europe cares about justice being done. And it is also important for, I think, all of us, and specifically for Ukrainians who would see it as a practical assistance in getting those responsible for these horrible crimes to justice.
Thank you. And are there more questions? Yeah, in the corner. And then in the middle. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Yaryna. I have a question about perception. So recently, Trump and Trump-led administration, they made ridiculous posts on Twitter, X, and if someone was not to check, fact-checked, or apply critical thinking to those statements, they would, in a way, it's another type of propaganda about 4% support to Zelensky, amount of money sent for support to Ukraine. And my question is there a benefit or need for European leaders to be also more vocal on news or social media, or there is no benefit of fighting this very vocal new US president? Thank you.
Well, excellent question. And thankfully, I said something bad about President Macron earlier, but let me say something good about President Macron. I don't know if you saw it, but he just visited the White House, and actually him sitting next to him didn't stop President Trump, but, saying something which was completely false again, which is, for example, that Europe, the donations we've given to Ukraine are loans that Ukraine should pay back. And President Macron stopped him and said quite clearly for the American press, that's not true. And thank you for that, because, we have to stop the misinformation as much as possible. And yes, Europe should be more vocal about this. We are looking into ways, both from a European Union perspective, but also from a Danish perspective, in seeing how can we actively use NGOs, use our public broadcasting, use unofficial sources as well, to both combating misinformation, which is, targeting Europe. We talked about Romania earlier, but other countries as well, but also being used offensive in brackets, so that the Russian community actually get a sense of what is happening in true. And we are looking into it, but it's also a battlefield. It's also a battlefield. And right now, Russia/China is actually winning that war. So we have to gear up. But yes, absolutely, we are looking into how we can do it, and we are spending also money to it, and we also doing that from the Danish side as well.
There's a lot we can do to pick up the pieces of the wreckage of the American taxpayer-financed media and human rights ecosystem. It may well be that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is going to be closed down. We've seen the National Endowment for Democracy is under attack, US Institute for Peace, and many, many other things. And these are small amounts of money. I mean, you could give for one American fighter aircraft that won't work because Trump won't let you use it. You could basically replace a huge chunk of this. And we need to do that both in terms of the outreach to countries to the east of us, but also to shore up our own media system. So I think that's really important. But I slightly disagree. I think you've got to treat Trump like a 3-year-old. And you don't reason with a 3-year-old you bribe them, basically, if you can't intimidate them. You'd say, hey, look, here's some chocolate. Stop screaming and you can have some. And so I think we have to adopt a kind of ruthless transactional approach. I wish I'd studied drama studies and child psychiatry rather than economics and international relations. It might be more useful. But I think the Zelensky missed a trick, probably, with what he should have said when he was asked for this minerals deal, is produce an enormous map of Ukraine with lots of pictures of Trump on it and arrows pointing upwards, and say we are going to launch the Trump Minerals Consortium, and leave the details for later. And you know, our NATO Secretary General actually did that. He went into the Oval Office with a effectively meaningless map with lots of pictures of Trump on it for all the places he'd been to, and lots of arrows going up showing military spending, and said, Mr. President, you did this. And Trump said, that's really cool. Can I keep that? I may, a little apologies to the real poet, there may be a little bit of poetic exaggeration there, but that's basically what happened. So that's, we need these sort of imaginative, slightly phony things that distract him, because he always lives in the day, and you know, tomorrow will be another problem. So I think Macron may have done the right thing in correcting him in public. I think it's probably better to be reaching out to Senate Republicans and saying, you do know this is nonsense, and just try and wave bright, shiny things in front of the toddler and hope he starts screaming.
Thank you. And there was also,
My name is Frederick, and Yara talked about forgetfulness before. You could also call it denial or disavowal or anything like that, about what happened and what we didn't discuss in 2014 about the Russian invasion of part of Ukraine. We called it a civil war and other kinds of ridiculous things. This forgetfulness, I think there are also signs of that today. And Edward, you talked about business. Well, there's a lot of forgetfulness in our business community. Also a Danish one. There's one shoe company still paying taxes in Russia. There's also this Central Asia, like huge economic import-export hub from the West directly to Russia, which is ignored. So what about this hub? Is there something we can do about that, or should we forget about that?
Good question. First of all, there's a reason why I don't have Echo shoes anymore. I'm just stating. That's good. That's good. Good. But you raise an excellent point, of course. And yes, one of the main income for the Russian economy right now is actually still the energy. And you know, we're looking into the shadow fleet as well. Unfortunately, we have a lot of judicial problems even though they're sailing through Danish territory, we cannot just stop them. There are a lot of freedom of navigation laws and all of that. I'm not an expert in naval law, but there's a lot of problems with that. But we're looking into whatever we can do to trying to stop that. For example, the main thing right now is that they're all sailing in very old ships. So if they break down, there is a huge problem regarding the oil or whatever LNG will spill over into the Danish Sea. And therefore, we perhaps have a possibility in that sense in stating that they are too old. We're worried about their, breaking down or whatever, and we can actually try to stop them in that sense. So what I mean by that is we are trying to be very untraditional in trying to get the best outcome. And we are hoping that will perhaps stop the shadowing fleet for going through the Danish sea lanes. So that's just one thing. And yes, I really want EU to play a major role. We are supporting even stronger sanctions. We are fighting for even stronger sanctions. We are also fighting for spending the frozen assets here in Europe for Ukraine, absolutely. But we have not gotten momentum in the European Union for that yet. But we are fighting.
When I wrote my book, The New Cold War, in 2007, came out in 2008, I said that the Achilles heel of the West is greed and money. And I'm afraid that's still true. And I'm very worried now that American business is going to forget, just as it's forgotten all its social liberalism to please Trump, it's going to forget all its geopolitical hawkishness to please Trump. And we're going to see a stampede of American oil and gas companies back into Russia, which will be good for the Russian economy, give Putin's war machine more fuel, and will then create a strong pro-Russia lobby in Washington. And it'll be back to the 90s again, when people like me were shouted down because everybody else was making so much money.
Hi, my name's Adam. We talked a lot today about hard power and military spending and supporting Ukraine. Is there more Europe should be doing in terms of cyber and hybrid warfare? And what's your views on where we are with that at the moment?
Yes. Let me also state that I actually want to also invest in soft power as well. We're actually expanding our MFA expenditures, especially in the frontline states. So we have a huge or bigger output in countries like Moldova and Georgia, which is going on a shameful trajectory. But we're trying to do much more on soft power as well. But coming to a question, yeah. Huh, there are things I can say and something I cannot say because things are confidential. But this is new territory for us, and we are not as good at this as the Russians are and the Chinese are, and we have to keep up or get up, gear up for it. And we're trying to do that now. Absolutely. But I cannot actually go into details. I'm actually not allowed to do that. Sorry.
But I can. We need to learn both how to rebuild defense and how to rebuild deterrence in this, whatever you call it, grey zone, unconventional warfare. We've got a lot to learn from the Finns, whose comprehensive defense model persisted all the way through the 90s and the noughties, and they don't really like talking about it, but they've done some spectacular operations against Russian, what were effectively as a Russian base in their country, the Helmi base in the southwestern archipelago. And to this day, I don't know any Finns in the room. Finns hate being praised in public, so it's always quite fun. But if you ask the Finns, even now they say, the police investigation is continuing. And they've got total control over the sort of the narrative there. They can leak information out if they want, or they can shut up, which of course Finns love being silent, so that suits them. They're playing the same game with the ship they've impounded. The investigation is continuing, and it'll continue until they choose for it not to continue. So Finns are very good on the both on defence and on deterrence, but we need to rebuild our toolkit. We have cross-press release, summon in Russian diplomat, expel Russian diplomat, impose probably meaningless economic sanction, or launch nuclear weapons. And there's rather a large gap between the meaningless economic sanctions and the launch nuclear weapons. And we need to rebuild that. And I've been working on this, on what we call lateral asymmetric deterrence, which is if I punch you, you don't punch me back, but Natalia comes and pours a glass of water over me. And that has two effects. One is I'm wet and cold. And secondly, I think, oh dear, Adam's got friends. And that's very upsetting for the Russians because they basically don't have friends. So we need to really think outside the box and have a big list of deterrent measures which really keep the Russians on their toes. Putin should wake up each morning thinking, oh shit, what are they going to do to me today? The moment we wake up every morning and think, oh shit, what's he going to do to us today? But we can do that. We are big, rich, inventive countries. There's lots of stuff we can do. It just requires breaking the rules a bit. And I'm delighted that your committee is looking at these things, even though you can't talk about it.
That we actually have one thing that's benefiting us a lot. I think it's 1.5 million Russians, IT persons who actually fled Russia because they didn't want to be drafted. And they're now out in Europe, they're now out in the US as well. So there are actually possibility there to also, employ people like that who has enormous capacity and also, of course, know the Russian language as well. So I'm just stating.
and you talked about maritime laws, etc. But I think that perhaps we should look at things in another way, because if a criminal is trying to rob me, then perhaps I would use methods that are not normal and that are not lawful. Because if someone breaks the law, perhaps I should allow myself to break the law too.
Um, uh, we uphold to all international regulations, and we will do that. I understand the question, and know if a criminal is using different tools, we should have something to reply to that or combat that. So I understand the questions, but we should be better as well, in my sense, and we are better than that. But I understand it, and it is difficult to defend against someone who is actually, a war criminal. It is, of course, difficult. But then again, there's a reason why Ukraine wants to be part of Europe. That's because we're better, and we should still be better.
I think I'd just like to pose one question, and maybe it's for you, Michael, or it's just that the danger that we see today, the danger that are preeminent, the way that Europe has to step up, the threat that you say come from Russia to us, is there a cause for actually saying to the companies of Europe that they need to mobilize, just like the Russians have mobilized their economy to be geared to war, that we actually need to, request something specific from our companies in order to gear up and match that? How do you see that? Is that something being discussed?
We are discussing everything. We're discussing everything from building up new air raid shelters. We actually stopped back when I was mayor, which is many years ago, 22 years ago. We actually stopped demanding that every time we build any new larger building, there should be an air raid shelter. We stopped that. Now we're talking about, should we implement that again? Because, if we need it, we cannot just build it, then it should be there. So we're looking into that. We're looking into other areas as well. Should we somehow generate, more military equipment? And there's been a lot of talk about that in Danish press. And thankfully, in a matter of a few months, we should have a contract regarding restarting the Danish ammunition factory. And I hope that will go through. And as you know, we have actually gave back the power to our chief of defense, who will be able to actually make more and more decisions on his own. So it's not being stopped by political bureaucracy as it has been. So we are more and more organizing to be, let's say it, battle ready. And yes, also Danish companies can and will play a major role in that, but we will scale it up as needs be.
I don't think we've done nearly enough, and the mentality in the corporate world is still basically our job is to make money. Your job is to make the laws. We just get on with our stuff. And I think the idea that corporate citizenship involves caring about national security is baked into countries in places like Estonia and Finland, and it disappears once you go further west. I'm very struck by the way in which the big defense companies have been buying up innovative small companies in order to close them down. I think that's really scandalous. You have these companies with fantastic new products, and big companies think that's a terrible threat to our profitability. So let's just buy it, and we'll say we're going to develop the product further, and we don't. It was very funny. There's an Estonian drone company which is actually anti-aircraft missiles, and they've had every big Western company trying to buy them, and they just say no. They don't care how many noughts you put on the end. Our two shareholders are the chief of the defence staff and the former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defence, And we're doing this because we want to defend our country, not because we want to get rich. And the Western defense companies can't understand that. It just doesn't compute. But actually, 60, 70 years ago, we saw our defense companies as part of our critical national infrastructure, and they were motivated by patriotism as well as by business. And that's certainly true in Ukraine. So we need a fundamental change in our culture to get back to the idea that we're in a war and we could lose it. We really could lose. It's worth just spending a couple of minutes thinking what it would really look like if we folded, and what sort of life we'd all lead, and then go back with redoubled urgency to do the stuff that we need to do.
Thank you. It's horrifying. But Maksym, before I think actually, is there one more question or? Okay, yeah. Final question.
Well, thank you for a very fascinating evening, and I would just like to say to the mother here, wow, I'm so in awe of you. Gear up, Kub. Where is all the money coming from? We've had this peace dividend, as it's called in Europe, and we've built up wonderful social security for many of the people, and we've gotten kind of used to that. I was quite shocked to see the British Prime Minister on TV today saying, oh, yes, we're going to gear up to 2.5%. And I'm like, huh? I mean, you've got inflation of at least 3% or 4% in UK, so that's actually negative growth, but never mind. So I'm thinking to myself, since not every country is in a euro-denominated currency, why did we make a sort of, I think in World War II, at least in the United States, there was war bonds that you could buy. Why don't we make a common European war bond financing and distribute the need for this massive amount of money that we're all talking about? And I actually worked for the U.S. Navy at one point at Grumman, looking at the F-14 Tomcats. And there is a lot of waste, I can tell you. There was actually quite a big scandal that we discovered while I was there. Never mind. This crib business, that's dangerous. I hate to tell you. You cannot just run out and buy anything. But where's the product? So if everybody's chasing the same piece of pizza, and it gets more and more expensive, when does it end? So I want to know, what is the European approach to a common defense buildup with common financing?
Good question. And let me just also state that we actually in Denmark are saying 3% is our floor, not 2.5% as the Brits are saying apparently, but we say 3%, and our inflation rate is a lot lower than what's in Britain at the moment as well. But you raise an excellent point. Just before we had a general election in Denmark the last time, we actually had a referendum as well, which were regarding our opt-out on defense cooperation in the European Union. Thankfully, there was a big majority in the Danish population who voted in favor of removing that opt-out. Why I'm saying that is because it should be regarding the European Union defense cooperation in trying to both organize more and more cooperation regarding defense industry, but also in trying to organize how we get the money necessary for it. It's too early to talk about the president. We're taking over the EU presidency for this autumn. It's too early to reveal what the program for our presidency will be, but I don't think it's come as a big surprise that security will be on top of it. It will be our main topic when we take over the presidency. And this is something we will actually raise with our colleagues and our allies in trying to say, how can we do that? So that's one thing. The second thing we're doing in Denmark is actually we have billions of Danish kroners invested through the Danish population investing their retirement funds. So we are talking with private companies who have these billions of Danish kroners in retirement funds. Why don't you invest in military industry as well. We cannot tell them to do that, but we can ask them nicely. So we're asking them very nicely to do that, perhaps a bit more, and we're trying to organize the private money in that sense as well. So there's both a Danish perspective on that, and there's also the European perspective as a state. I hope that answered your question.
I think there's a lot more we can do to get money. And there's two questions. One is where does the money come from? And secondly, where's the capacity? ESG, environmental, social, green stuff, often includes a no defense investment clause. There's a lot of money out there which cannot, according to the rules of the people managing it, go into defense. The credit rating agencies count defense as risky. So you get a lower credit rating if you're involved in defense. Those are just the rules. We can change that, and we should do. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think there's no free lunch. This will involve sacrifices. It'll mean, I think Denmark decided to work an extra day every year. Didn't you give up a public holiday? So,
But don't mention that.
well, there's plenty of scope for that in other countries as well. And when the Americans say we get 2 weeks vacation, you get 6, and we're paying for your defense, why does that work out? I have to say, I think the Americans have a point. We can certainly spend the money more efficiently. But in the end, we've got to invest in more capacity. And that's where I think the idea of the defense bank comes in. And you can raise a lot of money on the international capital markets as a AAA rated bank. And then you target it in particularly rebuilding stockpiles. I'm not so much in favor of buying fancy new platforms. The most important thing for the next couple of years, based on what your defense intelligence published a couple of weeks ago, is to make sure we've got the munitions for the platforms we've got. And we don't at the moment. And the Finns do. But the Brits did an artillery exercise in Finland the other day, and the Finns said, yes, all your 14 guns are brilliant, but you have enough ammunition for 3 days, and we have enough ammunition for 3 months, and the capacity to build more. So I think that the immediate deterrent priority is to rebuild the really basic stuff of shells and other munitions, and then build the production lines so that we don't get this kind of slice of pizza auction that you're talking about. But in the end, we can do this. We did it pretty well during COVID. We got huge production lines going for vaccines. We let down the rest of the world, but the rich world pretty much got its act together with COVID. So this is, as with the other problems we've discussed, it's fundamentally a question of political will rather than a question of means.
Actually, I'd like to give the last word to Maksym. But before, I just want to say thank you to Natalia Povovich and the Ukraine House. I'd like to say thank you to Edward Lucas, Michael Aastrup, and Maksym. But I think, and Slava Ukraina, Geroyam Slava, and the last word to you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to join the expression of gratitude to the organizers of this event, to my fellow panelists, and to you for moderating this discussion, Charlotte. Thank you very much to all of you for coming to attend it. It's been on these sad days of the 3rd anniversary of full-scale invasion into Ukraine, but it is really important for us also to remember and to remind that the war is going on not for 3 years, but for 11 years, and unfortunately for most part of it in full ignorance of the majorities of European nations. But it's not the case anymore, and I hope it will not be the case in the future. I really see that it is more and more perceived as the common struggle and common fight. I met people here and in other European cities who came around just to say thank you to me as a member of the defense forces of Ukraine, Ukrainian armed forces in particular. Thank you for defending us, they said to me, which was very touching, but which was very true. It is very true. This is what we're trying to do. Each of us already have the list of those who paid the ultimate price for it. our friends, our relatives. The space we're in now hosts the exhibition of Ukrainian literary posters, and some of these quotes are very familiar, and some of them are extremely heartbreaking, I should say. If you have a minute, just please go around and have a look, because there are translations available. So we're paying huge toll, but we're doing this because it is really important, because without it, we are not Ukrainians, meaning we are not free people. We are much less humans, because we try to defend our people, our loved ones, and all those who live in solidarity with us from the force which is dehumanizing and which brings death and destruction. And unfortunately, we all had to see it firsthand. So we won't be able to forget it. And we also, I'm just calling you not to forget that either. I think we can do it, of course. And I said it several times, and I'm going to repeat it as long as it takes, that the empire will fall, and we'll help it to do that. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you so much. Edward Lupis, Michael Aastrup Jensen, Charlotte, thank you so much for this partnership. I love these discussions where there is so much clarity and so much honesty, and I think we stay true to that. Maksym, thank you very much for your eyewitness account, and also to Yaryna for the opening remarks and everything you've shared with us, and obviously for your sacrifice. I want to take a moment and thank you, the audience, for coming to our events, to this particular event, but also join in inviting you to view two exhibitions right now taking place at Ukraine House. The literary poster that Maksym has already so well described. It comes from Odessa. Odessa City Letters Project is another city, just like Mykolaiv, that Denmark is supporting so much. Odessa has this, the spirit that cannot be conquered, and it's great that its artists continue to create. And we as Ukraine House in Denmark are extremely privileged and thankful for your support, of your government, of the parliament, that we have that we have a chance to continue to help explain and meet you, the real Ukraine. So we are extremely privileged. And on the second floor, we have the exhibition of dedication to Polina Rayko. She was a 69-year-old Ukrainian woman living on Alashki, Kherson region in the south of Ukraine, who started painting only when she was 69. She created this house of hers, became the temple of naive art. Unfortunately, when Russians decided to blow up the Kakhovka Dam, it was not only the act of ecocide, the unimaginable crime against environment, but also it destroyed the house. But the images that you will see upstairs are kind of the last tribute to her work. And we have some wine and snacks upstairs, so we hope you'll continue to reflect on what we've heard and invite everybody to stay on and discuss. Thank you very much again for being with us.